So what are the roles that I typically see? And I've asked you, and we'll show you the survey results from the folks who are participating here in this seminar today. What are the roles that the Chief Human Resource Officer can play in developing the team? The first one is the most obvious one, player only. And the responses I got from a few of you is this is what we do. I take care of myself, and if an executive happens to stumble across my doorstep asking for help, I can figure out what kind of resource they need. But that's about what I think I can accomplish here, and that's what I've been asked to do, and I haven't so far been able to get much more turf than that. The second one is the facilitator of key scheduled or impromptu meetings. The HR person now, the HR executive is now in a place where you're beginning to manage what kinds of conversations occur with what stakeholders in the room at what time, and helping that team indirectly by doing that, by designing the meetings, helping that team work together more effectively. So it's more indirect. But I've seen this happen in a number of corporations. They say, okay, you go away and design the meeting. Here's what we're trying to accomplish. You talk to so-and-so and figure out how we do that best. When you have like large group interventions, for those of you who are familiar with that, it's basically asking the simple question, who needs to be in the room to do this work? What's the conversation we need to have? What's the intent? And how do we get there? It's fascinating to me when I work with executive teams that they don't know when they're having the conversation, why they're having the conversation. I mean, it sounds crazy, right? But nobody says, the reason we're having this conversation is I'm 90% have my mind made up. I just want you to look at it and poke and see if there's any soft spots. But when we're done, it's a done deal. Unless you can really, stop me before I kill again. But if this is good enough, we're going ahead. Other people look at that and think, oh, the door is wide open. We can debate this thing all over again. And you have this bizarre conversation. Or the second option is somebody comes in and says, I think I've got 2 or 3 alternatives. By the end of this conversation, I want to land on one. I need your input. Or a third variation is, I'm looking at this problem. I have no clue. I've looked at all the reasonable alternatives, the usual suspects. I can't come up. We need to brainstorm and do this. Rarely are executives explicit about that. It's usually a report out of a decision that's already been made. So being able to work number 2 can be very, very effective. Being the lead sponsor. You're the thought leader and the person who pushes them out of their comfort zone. You're the person that gets them to go have different experiences. You're the person that has them go visit XYZ Corporation to see how this is done better. Or, what's interesting, in the 1990s, everybody was doing external benchmarking. There were companies making money hand over fist, and they would take you to go talk to anybody you wanted to. And then one day somebody woke up and said, you know what? There's some internal best case examples in our own company. And the reason why they did that is because when they went to a different company that had a different culture, when they went to a company that had spent 8 years building Six Sigma, and they wanted to do it in like 6 months, he said, no. This is a huge change. It took forever for us to get there. You can't do it overnight. They began to realize that some of the best practices wouldn't work in our culture. We hadn't done all the work behind this. If you want to see an example of that, Google my last name and Atlantis. And it's a case study. It's one of the few things I wrote. It's a case study on how they developed a coaching culture to get customer satisfaction ratings higher than they ever got in the past. But it's about Miss Saunders, who is the head of OD, and I had worked with her, but it's really her story of what they had done over a period of 4 or 5 years of creating an environment where they made a number of changes and they got the kind of results that they were looking for. And she worked with the head of HR to do that, and they changed the culture of the organization. Are you accepted as an informal coach about incidental overt behavior? What that means is, are you given legitimate role to pull people aside and say, that was really good? Or, geez, that really didn't go well. Let's talk about how you could do it differently. So you're sort of the internal corporate social worker, which is okay, and it's one of the roles, and it can be very, very valuable. It's too bad your other colleagues at the same level are not prepared to do the same thing. When they see bad behavior, they probably know what better behavior looks like as well. Number 5 is you should be in a role, and when I do coaching, I depend on the senior HR executive because you guys hear all kinds of stuff, and it helps me prepare for what I'm likely to hear in the 360. But you can be a good internal coach to the external coach. And you can also be a good internal coach to people and executives inside the company. What this means is you're a legitimate part of somebody's development plan. You are identified as a person. So what we try and identify, the coach, if you use an external coach, the external coach, I tell people, I'm not omniscient and omnipresent. I'm not with you every step of the day. I can't see what you're doing. So the fact is, if you see me in certain kinds of situations where I'm trying to engage my employees more effectively in a meeting and you're in that meeting, I'm going to contract with you to say, you know, what I'm trying to do is give my employees at least, I don't know, a benchmark of 50% of the airtime. At the end of the meeting, would you come over and talk to me for 5 minutes and tell me whether I'm doing that or not, or what's working and what's not working? And you can do that very, very quietly. Most companies do that informally. Cisco is an example of formalization. They actually have something called the ecosystem. And it's you're responsible for giving me feedback. And if you don't, and it's not seen online, somebody's asking you why you're not giving me feedback. It's highly formalized. It's probably the other extreme. You can serve a huge, huge value-added role in giving people constructive ongoing feedback and modeling that for other people. You can also be the confidant to the CEO, and a number of you are, about people assessments, influences, and decisions. It is a double-edged sword. So now, the question is, if you're doing 6, can you do 5? The question that executives speak to me about when I'm an executive coach, there's 2 things I can say back to either the board or the CEO or whoever's sponsoring the coaching. I can tell them whether you're involved in the coaching and whether you're making progress, and that's it. If you want to know what the feedback was, talk to the executive. They'll share with you what they're comfortable with. If you want to know what their development plan is and what they're working on, talk to the executive. I'm not the messenger boy. I don't want to be in that position. It's not fair to them. So usually the executive has total control over the information that they have. And when I talk to them about, gee, in these other companies, gee, you had an internal coach. How did that go? Well, it was great, but it only got us so far. Why? Because I couldn't really talk about some of the uncertainties that I had. I couldn't talk about some of my demons because I never knew how far that information was going to go. And at some point, the CEO is going to turn to the Chief Human Resources Officer and say, what do you think about Gary? And your judgment's going to be tainted, potentially, by some of the moments when I was vulnerable. And that could be held against me. That's an interesting question. Somebody said, can this information be held against me? So you want to think very carefully about walking that fine line. And we'll talk about that. But one of the ways you can do that is being very explicit with people about what the limits of confidentiality are. I got 13 responses to the survey. This is what people are doing. It's a little bit of everything. And I think this reflects people's attempts to deal with different personalities, different situations. A number of people are in player-only situations, but they also augmented it with a few other things. A number of people see themselves as confidants to the CEO. Very few people are involved in sort of a formalized feedback network. A lot of people are in the traditional role of the informal coach dealing with infrequent incidental behavior. And a number of people are in what I think is still a high leverage role of designing the meetings, of really controlling the conversations the executives are going to have. Informal meetings. They obviously are going to have informal meetings outside. What are some of the common tactics that people use? Self-made offsites, right? We're just going to design something and go do it. Okay, maybe you're good at it. That's great. Simulations. A lot of people are using simulations. What I'll focus on that later on is that usually focuses on knowledge and skills and occasionally on social role. It doesn't get down to some of the more important parts of the executive's personality and some of the drivers. I love the inspirational experiences. Ford Motor Company took its top senior executive group to Ford football field, and they had the whole thing to themselves. Now, they loved it, and they got to meet the players, and they got to throw some footballs, and they got to do some other things, and they got to hear the history of all the challenges that they faced to develop that business. It's great. My question is, when they got back to the office on Monday morning, what was different? I have clients who send people to Colorado to go see the Olympic teams in the Olympic Training Center. They come back with wonderful stories about, gee, we saw this videotape of the cyclist, and if it's starting of the race, if their wheel wiggles back and forth a quarter of an inch, they're going to come in 0.5 seconds behind somebody, and they've got this whole thing, and I said, gee, that's a great story. That's really interesting. So what are you doing differently on Monday morning as a result of having looked at the bicycle? So we have a lot of people who go out and hear inspirational speakers. They have wonderful inspirational experiences. The question is, how does that translate into different behavior when they get back on the job? If all you want is entertainment, then just call it entertainment. That's great. It's like Dr. Phil. He doesn't have a license to practice. Most people don't know that. So it can't be therapy, must be entertainment. Exactly. We talked about internal facilitator or coach. I think it's still a very key role, and particularly if you can influence other people's views in a much more balanced way, looking at the pros and cons. 5 we've already talked about. 6 is important. How do you assess what the developmental needs of either the individuals or the team are? And how do you evaluate progress or success? Are we where we should be as an executive team, or are we lacking somewhere? And then discipline, this is something that you can influence, particularly if you're designing the meetings. It's amazing to me the number of senior executive teams when I do a developmental needs assessment, just an informal series of interviews. And I say, what does this team need to do? What are some of the problems the team faces? And they say, you know, we have these discussions, we make decisions, we give people assignments, we never hear about it again. It evaporates, it disappears, it goes away. We don't have any follow-up. And you know what, 6 months later, same issues pop back up. We need to have a follow-up on accountability. The CEO needs to have a dashboard of metrics to figure out who's doing what and how we're driving the business, et cetera, et cetera. There's often a lack of discipline. The HR executive can help develop the team to do that as well. What approaches do you guys use? The participants here. Number of folks home bake your offsites? Good, I hope it works. Number of folks, interestingly, engage in simulations. We visit other businesses, not so much. Internal facilitator, sometimes. Again, we evaluate the progress of developmental efforts of the individual or team. That's fascinating. How do you do that? A number of people say they do. I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but it would be interesting if you had a specific example. We had somebody ask in the last session, if you have a specific example of how you do that, if you'd spend 2 minutes sending me an email on how it is that you do that, I'll post it in a place where you guys can see it, and we'll move forward on that. If we have time to talk at the end of this presentation, we'll take a look at that. What other kinds of things do you use? Accountability and action item follow-up. A lot of folks use that. I think when I go to Purdue to teach my executive MBA program on Saturday, I'm going to be there by myself, according to this. Don't use it that much. It makes sense, though, in retrospect, because most of the people in my executive MBA program have 6 to 10 years of experience. They're really not in the upper echelons yet. But there are certain things, God knows we all get bombarded by Harvard and Princeton and Stanford and everybody else who has special CEO programs. They cost a mint. And my favorite one recently is that you get to go to a castle in England and spend a week or 2 weeks or something inside of this castle, and you get to meet the Queen or something. I don't know. And it costs $1 gazillion. And my question is, if you want to go be entertained, that's great. But how is this going? What's different when my favorite question? What's different when you come back on the job on Monday morning? These are some of the responses you gave to my question about what are the biggest challenges you face trying to support the development of the C-suite team as a team or individuals. We got folks who've been here forever. They're comfortable with the current state, and they don't know what better looks like. We're not really good on onboarding new members onto the team. We really don't manage that very well. I have a CEO this past week when I talked to him, he said, I'm sorry, John, we brought you on board. We did a really crappy job of onboarding you. We basically told you, here's your desk. I'll see you in 2 months. Nobody introduced him and gave him air cover to be introduced to all the various stakeholders. It was just, and so now it's 9 months later, and we're sort of pushing the restart button to try and help him again. I often share the pulse of the organization, but this information is received with frustration. I love this. So you get the employee engagement piece, and people going, wait a minute, we've been doing all this really cool, sexy stuff. Why doesn't anybody recognize this? It's because there is, and I see it every day I walk into a company, is there's a glass floor. Below the C-suite level, and maybe the next layer down, you go one more level, and there's a glass floor. These folks have been talking about the business issues and why we've chosen to do one thing versus another and why we've gone down certain dead-end kinds of things. So I call it the marathon effect, right? So I've only run one marathon in my life. That was enough. I can tell you it's 26.2 miles. The last 6 are just brutal. But if you've ever run a marathon, what they do is they take the world-class players and they put racers and they put them in front, and then the next slower races and the next slower races and the people who run slower and slower and slower. So they're not running over each other once the gun starts, right? So I'm way the heck back here somewhere, obviously. So by the time I get to the starting gate, the world-class runners have already run 3 miles, all right? And I'm just starting the race, crossing the starting line. The problem with senior executives is they've been mulling this stuff over. They have access to information other people don't have. They've gone down dead ends. They've turned the Rubik's Cube around 20 or 30 different times. And they finally arrive at a decision, which just at that point looks blatantly obvious to them. And they announce to the organization, we're going here. And they're at mile 22. And there's 2,000 people standing at the starting gate in running shoes and shorts saying, what race? The communications effort and engaging people on how we got to where we are and where we're going is huge. It's monstrous. So a lot of this it's not surprising. And when organizations are going through change, and I do a lot of change consulting with senior executives, and my advice to them is, you are going to underestimate the need for communications by a factor of 1,000. Because there's basically 3 buckets of people when you're managing change. There's the early adopters, right? Like, hey, we finally figured it out. Somebody smelled the coffee. Let's go full speed ahead. I'm on board. Sign me up. Let's go. We should have done this a long time ago. There's a second bucket of people who are the healthy skeptics, right? And those are the folks of, the CEO went to a seminar. Dave Ulrich talked to him. They read a book. They hired Gary as a coach. Something happened. This is just kind of the flavor of the month. Let's see if they're really serious about it. I'll get one leg in the boat, but one leg on the dock. I'm not fully committing myself. I'll get started on this. Let's see where this goes. Then there's the third bucket, which is the ostriches with their head in the sand. I've been here 15 years. I've seen him come and go. He'll go in or she will go in a couple of years. I'm just going to keep a very low profile, business as usual, and once they're gone, I'm going to go back to my comfort zone. Which of those buckets do you focus on if you're leading change? Number 2. Give the lady a pound of duck down. Number 2, you get more converts over to bucket number 1. Number 3 will sort itself out. Number 3 will say, this isn't the place I joined up in 15 years ago. It's not the same place. Or they'll leave, or you'll end up firing them because they'll just stand out as not being on board. So this piece here is not surprising. And the question is, how do you help people jump level? How do jump level meetings? How do you have people really spend time? I had somebody who recently took the entire executive team on a private corporate jet, and they got their ticket punched on going to all the plants. So they thought that was good. The feedback from the plants that I had when I did the 360s was they didn't spend enough time here. They showed up, they kind of shook everybody's hand, said, hi, I'm so-and-so, and got off on the next plane because they had to go to the next plant. It's like, did you really hear the people? Did the people felt heard? You can help with that. When I asked for assistance at the 11 hour, clearly the support should have been there at the onset. Hey, by the way, there's a fire out of control. Here's a bucket of water. Geez, why didn't you get me involved earlier in this? People don't see a need for development. There's a guy who I know who's very good. He's a very good physical coach, holistic coach, and he says most human beings deal with themselves, with their bodies, as if they're a lollipop on top of a stick. All head, no body. This is kind of like having a company being all processes and systems and no people. People need to be developed. And number 6, getting the right people at the table to involve. So this is like, I would encourage you when you're thinking about the top executive team and developing employees, think about it as a change management process. And if you want a copy of a more involved thing, just email me. But we put one together at Amico where we needed to have, we were talking to a number of different business units, and I had 3 gurus in charge of change management. Unfortunately, they read 3 different books. They had 3 different religions. And when they showed it to the executives, they thought it was all different. And they're looking at me like, I thought we had one approach. And no, apparently we think we have 3 approaches. So I put them in a room, and I said, don't come out until you find the commonalities in all the models that you're willing to commit to it. And it all makes sense as a result. We call that convergent validity, right? If we're all talking about the same thing, just with different labels, it's probably the right stuff. So we came out with this model. I'll send it to you. But one of the first things you do is you get a critical mass of people to support you. You build alliances. So you go off and you socialize a lot of your ideas. So when you bring these ideas forward, it's not you carrying your water, it's somebody else. Another key executive or another opinion leader. I love number 7. I just had this conversation this week. What we don't know about you, Mr. COO, is because you live someplace else. I can't walk out my door down the hall and get a quick response from you. He's off the radar. Affordable resources, number 8. I worked with the largest not-for-profit research organization in the world. They've hired me repeatedly as an executive coach. If it needs to be done, you will find the resource. They consider it to be an investment. There are companies that I work with I cannot name. I have a confidentiality agreement. They believe that the development efforts, of which I'm just one part, that they're doing with their executives is such a competitive advantage, they don't want anybody else to know about it. Okay? It's an investment. You got to get to that point as well. Oh, and I love number 10. I teach at Purdue in their executive MBA program once a year just to stay fresh and to keep in touch with people who are sort of in the middle management ranks and see how they're thinking. And it's wonderful because I could show them things that allow them. I've changed a few people's lives, not intentionally, but I did, and for the better. But I did go to one faculty meeting. This is why David writes books and I'm in the trenches. One faculty meeting was enough. I thought I was going to take. Any of you have been to an MBA faculty meeting, you'd want to take hostages and get out of there as soon as possible. It's not something that's very productive. You're probably familiar with this. This is David McClellan's competency model. The question as you're starting to think about the interventions is, if we're going to go to this experience, are we focusing on skill and knowledge, and is that really what our developmental need is? Or are there certain individuals in the team that need to think about their social roles differently? Who gets to play devil's advocate? Who's the one who smooths things over? Who's the one who reinterprets things and reframes things so that it's more acceptable for people? What kinds of interventions would you have with your executives to get them to that point? When we start getting down to self-image and traits, that's usually where you're probably going to need somebody like the executive coach or a psychologist or somebody else to come in. And the reason is that that is opening up the kimono in such a point where you feel vulnerable enough to be able to talk about your internal demons. You can read about those in my blog. But things like the need to be the smartest kid in the room, the need to never immediately join up, the need to be freakishly independent. Where does that all come from? And how do we put, if somebody has skill, knowledge, industry expertise, and we need to manage those. A lot of executives who go through these development plans in executive coaching, we get to a level where they say, you know, I feel like I'm driving with one foot on the brake and one foot on the gas at the same time. I'm stopping things that get in my way that I would normally do unintentionally if I hadn't thought about it, self-aware. And I'm doing things, I'm dialing things up or dialing things down or doing things in a different way, self-correcting, right? So as you're starting to do the developmental needs assessment, those are the kinds of things you're obviously wanting to think about.